Let's plays, music videos, and parodies are what got Five Nights at Freddy's its initial wave of popularity. But what kept people to it was its story. The infinitely repetitive gameplay is definitely not something capable of sustaining a fanbase for this long. And neither are the countless expendable Let's Plays that can only really be enjoyed once when they first come out. As for the music videos and fan games, those are works of their own, that are only tangentially related to the original games. Most of them can be enjoyed by anyone, regardless if they're a fan of the main series or not. So the only thing of lasting value these games ever had, was their story, and that is pretty clear. Even today, with the community more dead than ever, theories are still being constantly discussed by anyone retaining even a mild interest in the series. If you were ever a Five Nights at Freddy's fan, chances are you were at least somewhat interested in the lore. So what happened with that lore? How did it conclude? Because personally, I have no idea. I stopped paying attention to the series years ago, and I know I'm far from being the only one who eventually lost interest, and has barely touched the newer releases. Why is that?
So when you were making Five Nights at Freddy's 1, were you already planning on making a sequel? Or any other ideas what were flinging in your head on what to do?
I definitely left a lot of things open-ended, you know, in case I wanted to expand upon them later. I mean, obviously, like I did not have the entire story planned out, as I know there's much debate about that on the subreddit. It's like, oh, you know, he's some kind of mad genius that had, you know, 7 games planned out from the beginning. No, I didn't.
When making a creative work of any type, planning ahead is something that depends entirely on your character. Even the most organized person in the world would want to give themselves at least some space for improvisation along the way, because you never know when inspiration might hit. So beginning a story without fully knowing where it is going is not only normal, it is arguably the only way anything is ever made. And this seems to be exactly what Scott Cawthon, the creator of Five Nights at Freddy's, was doing when he released the first game back in 2014. He created a unique experience that stands on its own, but also leaves room for future development of a more full-fledged story, thus both testing the waters to see how people would react in terms of gameplay, and creating interest in terms of story. Nearly every big series starts like this. And thus, Five Nights at Freddy's was born, immediately becoming a gigantic success, and leading Scott to continue the series, exponentially expanding its scope along the way. Five Nights at Freddy's 1 was followed by Five Nights at Freddy's 2, which set the basics for the story, then by Five Nights at Freddy's 3, which showed us how the story would end, and finally, by Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which gave us a look into some key past events, to help us make more sense of the timeline. And that was pretty much the end of the Five Nights at Freddy's story. Not everything was resolved clearly, and many people were left confused. But as Scott wrote in a Steam post at the time, everything he deemed necessary, he had already added. If people didn't understand it all, he was not going to just reveal it for their sake. Scott, as a creator, had finished the story he wanted to tell. It was not perfect, obviously, with its themes being somewhat unclear, and some elements being inconsistent or unexplained, but at least it ended in an interesting enough way, making it so the games would stand on their own for the time to come. The Five Nights at Freddy's story was done, and it was time to move on. Except, that's not really what happened. A few months later, Scott released a book related to the series, which revealed tons of characters and story events that had never even been hinted at in the games. And pretty soon after that, Scott continued by releasing more books, more merchandise, and weirdest of all, more games, with even more to come in the future. all of them introducing new concepts, new characters, new animatronics, new ideas, new everything. I stopped paying attention pretty soon, but from what I can tell, the story became so dense that eventually even Scott himself had to come out and apologize for sometimes making mistakes when working on parts of his own story. To me, that just seemed ridiculous. Whatever Scott was building up to was something so incomprehensibly convoluted that following it became tiresome even for him. And unfortunately, this was probably how this series ended for many people, which seems to be a common case with media centered around mystery. Mystery, for the most part, refers to detective fiction, where a detective or someone fulfilling the role of one has to investigate a crime by connecting the clues along with the reader, eventually leading to finding out the culprit and reaching an explanation. Five Nights at Freddy's, however, follows a different type of mystery formula, specifically the one J.J. Abrams called the mystery box in his now infamous TED Talk from many years ago.
The thing is that it represents infinite possibility. It represents hope. It represents potential. And what I love about this box, and what I realized I sort of do in whatever it is that I do, is I find myself drawn to infinite possibility and that sense of potential. And I realize that mystery is the catalyst for imagination. Now, it's not the most groundbreaking idea, but when I started to think that maybe there are times when mystery is more important than knowledge, I started getting interested in this. And so I started thinking about Lost and the stuff that we do, and I realized, oh my God, like mystery boxes are everywhere in what I do.
In this type of story, the creator recognizes that what humans are inherently attracted to is mystery itself, and thus makes that the focus, while neglecting the solution part. This method, while effective in the short term, can cause negative effects after some time, because audiences can only appreciate cock-teasing when they are not aware of it. Dragging out a story when you are out of ideas is something people take notice of, as can be seen by looking at the backlash J.J. Abrams has gotten over the years. The problem inherent with this type of mystery is that to keep it going, the writer has to exponentially make things more complicated as time goes on. Answers can never be satisfying as they have to lead to more questions, and by the end the story has become something completely different than what it started out as. One way to still draw people in is to make each entry enjoyable and accessible on its own, so that people who discover it later are incentivized to go back and experience the previous entries. Five Nights at Freddy's, though, doesn't have that. Each game is dependent on you having played the previous ones, and makes no sense otherwise. So here we have an inaccessible mystery that can go on forever, and becomes worse over time. In a way, it seems doomed from the start. There was, however, one way Scott could have salvaged it, and that was ending it prematurely. If the aim of your series is mystery, then what better way to end than with a question? Leaving things open, but refusing to go on, both creates intrigue, and saves you from having to continue until you run out of ideas. Had Scott ended the series at around game 3 or 4, people might have looked back fondly on it by now. Even if there was a backlash at first, it would only be temporary. It wouldn't be long until it stopped. Unfortunately, we do not live in a reality where Scott killed the series when he needed to. Instead, what has happened is a slow and painful death that has alienated most of the old fans. And why is that the case? Well,
was this meant to be the final game?
I think when I was making that game, in my mind, that was the end of a trilogy.
Yeah.
You know, I think in my mind, the story was going to be 3 games. And in all honesty, I think Five Nights at Freddy's 3 was where I kind of started letting myself be driven a little bit more by criticisms of the game than maybe I had before. Before, everybody was just really, really excited, you know, happy to have all this stuff. But whenever 3 came out, I really was starting to pay attention to criticism. for instance, even though I may have, in some, alternate life, may have left the series alone at 3, people were not happy with the jump scare. And it's kind of as simple as that. People weren't happy with the jump scare of Springtrap. And
Scott Cawthon is a very creative and prolific person, but he has one flaw. He listens to his audience too much. Creating art is very often a struggle between the creator and the consuming audience. One person having total control over everything and not accepting criticism will usually just lead to creating something that only pleases them and no one else. Similarly, a person not having enough confidence in themselves and bending to their audience's whims on demand can be just as destructive, because fans rarely, if ever, know what they actually want. Finding the balance between these extremes is essential, and it is what Scott failed to do, which unfortunately led to Five Nights at Freddy's becoming what it is today. One individual person can make mistakes, and completely trusting yourself without listening to anyone else's opinion is foolish. But if you do the opposite, if you just listen to what others tell you to do, and then do it, is there even a point in you being there? Could you not just be replaced by anyone? Having confidence and taking risks is the only way to go. No one should be angry at Scott. He did what he thought was best, and there are plenty of people who enjoy his later works. But if you are not one of those people, and you have lost your interest in the series over the years, this is probably why. So remember, when making a game you want others to play, don't forget to bring the whip.